Today's video has been brought to you by Game of Thrones Dragonfire. Thank you to WB Games for supporting the channel. You can download Game of Thrones Dragonfire from both the Apple and Android app stores. Find out more about this new Westeros-based mobile game later in the video. When people think about large-scale conflicts in A Song of Ice and Fire, it's very easy to focus on the large and bloody battles, or the cloak and dagger betrayals. And while yes, these are important, there are other aspects of war that are just as vital but get overlooked. I am of course talking about the economic and resource side of a war. It's all well and good winning battles or assassinating a key target, but if you don't have a steady supply of food and resources to keep not just your troops but the small folk fed, then your war effort is built on quicksand. But more than that, wars cost money, and the very nature of conflict often means everything from raw materials to food costs considerably more. So managing your resources and how well you use them becomes vital in actually winning a war. This is something Game of Thrones Dragonfire and, well, the Dance of the Dragons itself highlights very well, and an issue that both the Blacks and the Greens, Rhaenyra and Aegon, deal with in equal measure. At the start of the Dance of the Dragons, the Greens hold King's Landing, and, more importantly, the Crown's treasury. As a result, the Blacks, using the Valyrian fleet, blockade the Gullet, meaning the only food and trade coming in and out of King's Landing is now overland, which is significantly slower. At first, we don't really see the impact of this until the war becomes very hot in the Riverlands. Both the Reach and the Riverlands are the breadbasket of Westeros, the main provider of food and resources to many of the other kingdoms. With the houses of the Riverlands divided and at war with each other, it means the only food and trade coming directly into King's Landing is from the surrounding Crown lands and the Reach, which too could just erupt into utter chaos and bloodshed at any given moment. When the Blacks later do capture King's Landing, while they don't have to deal with the blockade of Blackwater Bay, trade and food has all but stopped coming in from the Reach and Riverlands. All the while, the displaced small folk from these areas are fleeing to the relative safety of the walls of King's Landing, compounding the food situation even more, just adding to the unrest, meaning that the mood of the city is very tense and gets worse the longer the war drags on, with it all coming to a head with the Moon of Madness and the riots, eventually forcing Rhaenyra to abandon King's Landing altogether, especially after the destruction of the Dragon Pit. Now I just want to touch upon Game of Thrones Dragonfire here for a bit, because I think it does a really good job at mimicking aspects of the economic side of warfare and gets across the importance of resource management and where you choose to spend your limited resources. More than that, it demonstrates how resource gathering and trade is vital in not just maintaining a stronghold or a city, but also an active army, the very tool you need to wage war with and fight actual battles. Armies just don't spawn out of thin air. They need to be rallied and maintained. You need food, gold, and natural resources to maintain your strongholds or a city, which also then affects the amount of troops or the speed at which you can train them. All of this impacted by the resources you have available to you. It's how the powerful houses have stayed powerful. Thus, how well you do in a war depends massively on how you manage your resources and using them in the right ways. What I enjoyed about the gameplay loop of Game of Thrones Dragonfire is you need each of these things to grow and improve your power base, but to get these resources you need to actually control them. Each hexagonal node on the world map has a different resource associated with them. You can take control of those resources with your armies. The more important the resource, the harder it is to take. The more troops you need, and the more resources you have to invest in taking it in the first place. So it all kind of loops back into each other, and slowly over time you build up your stronghold, your armies, your power base, meaning you can then gather more resources quicker. What I find interesting is that these tiles generate resources passively, as long as you control them. You also get a bit of a boost from allies around you, which is definitely something that mimics real-world warfare and how trade works in Westeros. But the important part here is if you control these resources, the amount of resources you have coming in then correlates to how far your influence reaches, how many troops you can train, and how much you can grow as a faction. If your reach falls and you lose ground, and if you're not careful with how you manage your resources, your economy can start to shrink, and you can't actually then train the level of troops you need to without being on the front foot and recapturing resources and holding resources. So while it's not a one-to-one of how real-world trade and economy works in conflicts such as the Dance of the Dragons, it does a very good macro job at really highlighting the importance of resource management in conflicts. And frankly, like the Dance of the Dragons, and frankly many of the other wars in Westeros, like the Blackfire Rebellions and the War of the Five Kings. A key moment during the early stages of the War of the Five Kings is when Robb allows the Riverlords to go back to their holdings to repair their castles and gather the final harvest. Why? Because he knew just how important feeding his army is. Another way you can look at this is by the time the Blacks and Rhaenyra do come to control King's Landing, while they very much control the Riverlands, it's already been ravaged by war and trade is now all but halted. At the same time, the Greens control much of the Reach. Therefore, if you want to keep control of King's Landing, you need to actively secure the Reach, which is exactly why the first and second battles at Tumbleton happen, and why they are arguably, from the point of view of the Blacks and Rhaenyra, vital in maintaining the gains they made during the war. What I find so compelling about civil wars in general is often the war goals for both factions are similar. In the case of the Dance of the Dragons, both Aegon and Rhaenyra want to claim the Iron Throne. But like with the economics of war, you can't just rock up and take King's Landing if you're Rhaenyra. It's something that you have to build towards over time. In the case of the Blacks, their first move was to block off the Gullet, stopping all trade coming in and out of Blackwater Bay to places like Duskendale and King's Landing. Next, you send Daemon to secure Harrenhal, giving you a rallying point to take control of the Riverlands. And as we see, Daemon gets involved with the politics of the Riverlords, with most of the Riverlords who support the Greens taken out of the war by Daemon and houses loyal to Rhaenyra. Doing this cuts off trade and resources from the Riverlands from reaching King's Landing and Aegon and the Greens, putting them in a perilous position. They now have to strike back to regain control. And that's how you end up the Battle of Rook's Rest, and why Aemond and Criston Cole chose to march on Harrenhal, leaving King's Landing weakly defended. By Daemon taking Harrenhal, it draws them out and leaves King's Landing significantly weakened, while both the Blacks and the Greens can claim some sort of victory at the Battle of the Gullet. In all, it leads to Rhaenyra taking King's Landing very easily. With dragons, there was in theory nothing stopping Rhaenyra just flying to King's Landing and taking it with fire and blood at the very start of the war. But the cost of doing so would have been enormous and leaves the city a smoking ruin. She has more dragons than the Greens and had the manpower to do it, but thanks to the existence of Daemon and Corlys in the war, and Rhaenyra being aware of the high cost of such an attack, means they understand to reach their ultimate war goal of taking the Iron Throne, they have to work towards smaller goals to lessen the risk and damage, which is exactly what Daemon does with Harrenhal and Corlys in Blackwater. Hell, you could even argue that Blood and Cheese, the assassination of Jaehaerys, constitutes some kind of war goal that weakens the Green position. But because of the economic impact the Blacks' own offensive has on King's Landing, they themselves inherit a very perilous position. The Greens are on the march across the Reach from Old Town. In a way, has the same effect on Rhaenyra's hold on King's Landing as her own campaign in the Riverlands did with Aegon's. It all comes back to economics. The idea of war goals is an element of the Dance of the Dragons that really translates well into Game of Thrones Dragonfire. While in theory you could technically march straight to a seat of power or a powerful stronghold, but it's not going to end well. In fact, it's almost impossible. You've got to slowly build yourself up over time. Manage your resources, build better and larger armies with more powerful and more experienced troops and dragons. Take on smaller challenges and war goals. For example, before you can say attack the Eyrie, you might have to work together with your allies to control some nearby strongholds. So first you have to build yourself up to take these smaller places, before you can ultimately go for your bigger goal. This also is where the alliance system comes into play. If you work alongside others for a common cause, it will expedite things slightly and make it all a little bit easier. I do just want to touch upon the story aspects of Game of Thrones Dragonfire, because it's actually quite deep and a slow burning story. The game starts in the early reign of King Viserys I, around the same time he marries Alicent Hightower, and Daemon and Corlys are off in the Stepstones waging war against the Crabfeeder and the Triarchy. So about 106 AC by my reckoning. The tutorial for the dragon riding aspect of the game uses the Stepstones War as a backdrop, with the player being a new dragon rider under the command of Daemon and Corlys. We're then given our own keep in a region of Westeros of our choice, which very much affects the backdrop of the game. You spend the next few hours learning game mechanics while dealing with some local and family politics, with of course the story slowly building up to the Dance of the Dragons. In preparation for this video, I put maybe 10 hours into the game. You interact with young Rhaenyra quite a lot. Miss Saria also popped up for me, giving me intel on some family issues. From what I've seen, other big characters such as Aemon, Otto, Alicent, Corlys, Daemon pop in and out of the story as it moves forward. Oddly, for me, there are a few standout characters that are original to Game of Thrones Dragonfire. Jaela Waters is a Velaryon bastard. Her connection to the house is unclear, but given the size of the family and the amount of cousins, it's not hard to imagine a character like her could actually exist. What is compelling is other members of your household, given she's a bastard, are skeptical and wary of her, which does follow a lot of the themes of the books and the shows. She also seems to be a dragon dreamer, which ties back into House of the Dragon well, given how important dragon dreams and prophecy are to the show, where it's kind of a key plot point with Aegon's prophecy. And of course Helena's dragon dreams. I'm not sure how canon this idea of a Velaryon dragon dreamer actually is, but given how many times Targaryens and Velaryons have intermarried, and the fact that they are actually a Valyrian house, well, unlikely it's not a huge leap in logic a Velaryon bastard could actually be a dragon dreamer. In terms of how the story of Game of Thrones Dragonfire fits into the lore, I would say it has more in common with the show canon, given the depictions of the characters are show consistent. But it is kind of like an alternative universe of House of the Dragon, where there's a lot more dragon riding families, with the player character being one of them. In my own head, my character was a legitimized Targaryen or Velaryon bastard, so while liberties are taken with the lore, it makes perfect sense gameplay wise to do this and works well. There's nothing too egregious done. There is a fair bit of character customization as well, with loads of pre-made dragon riders to choose from. Me personally, as I was role-playing a dragon seed, I picked a Valyrian looking rider. I also made sure my house banner was dragon themed and had echoes of the Targaryen red and black. From a lore point of view, if we ignore the fact there are countless dragon riding houses in this timeline, this is kind of the situation I think could have happened post Dance of the Dragons if Rhaenyra and the Blacks had definitively won, and the Dragon Seeds had remained loyal till the end of the war. Off-White and Hugh Hammer were both knighted after the Battle of the Gullet. I think in a timeline where they remain loyal, the next step would be legitimization, but not as necessarily Targaryens, allowing them to form a cadet branch of the house, kind of like the Blackfires. You could even include Nettles in this as well. That would mean there were 3 new minor dragon riding houses, plus House Velaryon would be a dragon riding house via Adam. This could lead to a circumstance like Game of Thrones Dragonfire, where dragon riding houses are common. In fact, lore-wise, this is why House Targaryen were always very careful who they married into and allowed to have access to dragons. If other houses have dragons, it weakens what I call their nuclear deterrent, and means, like in the game, they would need to rely much more on alliances and diplomacy. Kind of a bit like what happens post Dance of the Dragons without dragons, when they had no dragons to rely on. Just I guess Aegon's conquest would have been a hell of a lot more fiery in this timeline. There are kind of 2 parts to the gameplay loop, the map-based resource management and conquest, and the dragon strikes. So each dragon you hatch has its own strengths and weaknesses, so you have to choose your army makeup based on what works well with the selected dragons. For example, some boost the impact of archers, meaning you pick your dragons around that. Archers are great against siege equipment and infantry, but weak against cavalry, with cavalry weak against spearmen, etc. So you want a good balance of strong dragons with different skills, so you have at least one army of each kind that can face each kind of foe. This does kind of work well within the lore of Westeros, especially with House of the Dragon. There are distinct different types of breeds of dragon, each with their own skill sets. For example, Syrax is a fast and mobile dragon, while Vhagar is powerful and tanky. So it kind of makes sense the gameplay of Game of Thrones Dragonfire tries to reflect this in some way. The Dragon Strike aspect of the game is also interesting. It's very different to the map-based conquest elements, being more real-time and giving you direct control over a dragon as you battle ships, ballistas, and try to capture castles, and in some levels even fighting other dragons. I appreciate it being a much more interactive way to gather resources than the more traditional RTS methods used within the rest of the game. You can unlock some classic dragons from the show like Vhagar, Caraxes, Syrax, but they take a lot of time to hatch, given just how rare and powerful they are. I'm not sure how the lore would work here with this, but it's one of those situations where gameplay just comes before lore, which isn't always a bad thing. I'm not typically a fan of mobile games, but Game of Thrones Dragonfire may have changed my mind a little bit on that. I of course played the game before I agreed to make this video, but I actually found myself playing a lot more of it after that. When I'm on the bus or waiting for a video to render or upload. It's surprising because it's equally great in 10-minute bursts, or if you want to sit down for an hour or two and really grind out some resources. I'm yet to run into any instances where you are artificially held back from progressing, which is an issue I had with a lot of mobile games in the past. I do just want to take a moment to thank WB Games for letting me tackle this video in the way I wanted to. I didn't just want to talk about Game of Thrones Dragonfire. I wanted to try and provide more value by weaving some lore from the books and the show into it, and talk about aspects of the Dance of the Dragons that often get overlooked, like the economical aspects that I think Game of Thrones Dragonfire really kind of helps highlight in a way that makes it easy to understand. Once again, I would like to thank WB Games for sponsoring today's video with Game of Thrones Dragonfire. You can download the game from both the Apple and Android app stores using the link in the description or the pinned comment below. If you're interested in joining my alliance in Game of Thrones Dragonfire, let me know in the comments.